The chaos was palpable. Amidst the lavish decorations and the ceremonial music, the bride's whispered words cut through the air like a knife. "He's not the one, not anymore." A gasp echoed through the crowd, the weight of the betrayal seeping into the very marrow of the moment. The groom, pale and trembling, stood motionless as his world shattered. The bride, eyes filled with both regret and resolve, turned to face someone else, someone who had been standing in the shadows all along. For the main character, this was more than just a moment of heartbreak. It was a revelation. The life they had known, the life they thought they were building, was all a lie. And in that lie, their own identity came into question. The world seemed to tilt as the whispers of betrayal spiraled around them. With every step the bride took toward the stranger, they felt their grip on reality slip further away. Was this all just a game? And what role had they been playing? As the room spun with whispers, the protagonist's world slowed. The truth was slipping through their fingers like sand. In this whirlwind of heartbreak, they searched for answers, searching for the familiar faces in the crowd, only to find strangers in places where they once saw safety. The love, the promises, the vows, they were all illusions. Everything felt like a lie. And then, the thought that had always lingered, the one they were afraid to admit, became undeniable. They were never meant to be here. They had always been alone, a wolf in a cage, pretending to be human. In the aftermath of the revelation, it wasn't just the bride who betrayed the groom, it was the very world they thought they knew. The guilt gnawed at them, the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths threatening to collapse the walls around them. How could they move forward when everything they thought they had was gone? The moonlight outside illuminated the window, casting long shadows across the floor. The protagonist stood by the glass, eyes lost in the night. Their mind raced, pieces of the puzzle they hadn't known were missing suddenly falling into place. The betrayal stung, but it wasn't just the personal wound that hurt. It was the crushing realization that everything they had believed was a lie. Their entire existence, shaped by others' lies and half-truths, now stood exposed. Who were they really? What had been withheld from them? The walls of the room, the walls of their life, felt too small, closing in on them. Outside, the world was vast, filled with unknowns, just like the truth they had been denied for so long. And there, beneath the cold moon, they made a silent vow. They would find their truth no matter the cost. They would tear down the walls that had confined them all these years. The following days were a blur of restless nights and whispered conversations that never reached their ears. The protagonist kept their distance from the world, retreating into the confines of their own mind. The questions piled up, each one more insistent than the last. Was it the betrayal that caused the ache, or the feeling of being invisible? The inability to see themselves reflected in anyone? The truth was clear now. They had been alone all along. Born without a pack, abandoned by their own kind, they had fought to belong in a world that never had a place for them. It wasn't just the absence of love that stung, it was the absence of understanding, of recognition. No one knew the real them. Not the bride, not the groom, not the stranger in the shadows, and certainly not the world that had rejected them time and time again. They were alone in a crowd. And it was in that painful isolation that they realized the power within them. The truth was no longer a whisper in the back of their mind. It had become a roar, an undeniable force that would not be ignored. They couldn't keep hiding from it any longer. The moment had come to face the Alpha, the one who held the answers to the questions that had tormented them for years. The figure in the shadows, the stranger who had always been just out of reach, was now at the center of it all. The pieces of the puzzle were finally aligning. But as they prepared to meet the Alpha face to face, something stirred deep within them. A mixture of fear and anticipation. This moment could change everything. It could destroy them, or it could set them free. There was no going back now. The door that had always been closed was finally opening, and they were about to step into a world they were never meant to know. The morning after the wedding felt empty, like the quiet that follows the storm. The protagonist walked through the halls of the mansion, trying to keep their mind from wandering back to the betrayal they had witnessed. They couldn't shake the weight of the truth that had been revealed. Despite the anger and betrayal that simmered in their chest, there was something more profound gnawing at them. The sense of emptiness that had always been there, even before the wedding. They had spent their life searching for something to fill the void, the feeling of belonging, of being part of something greater than themselves. But as the sun rose, casting pale light across the walls, they realized the truth was that they would never fit in, not in the way they had always hoped. The pack, the family, the connection, they were all just illusions. The realization settled heavy on their chest, and as they gazed out the window, they saw the world outside, vast and full of possibilities, but also just as lonely as they had always felt. The days passed in a blur of quiet reflection, but the feeling of being unmoored never left. The protagonists began to realize that they had never truly been a part of the world they inhabited. The very idea of family, love, and belonging had always been an illusion they clung to. With each passing day, they began to feel more disconnected from the people around them. They had witnessed betrayal, but what they hadn't fully understood was the betrayal of their own soul. The realization was like an anchor being dropped into the deep, silent ocean of their heart, pulling them into the depths of self-awareness. The quiet moments, the fleeting conversations, the glances exchanged, everything was filtered through this new understanding. They were a stranger to themselves, and the world seemed like a foreign place. It wasn't just about the pack. They were looking for something that had never existed within them, something that had always been just out of reach. The silence of the house became unbearable. It was in these quiet moments that the protagonist began to hear the whispers, faint, distant, like the echo of a world they hadn't fully understood. It wasn't just the betrayal of the wedding that gnawed at them. It was the deeper, unspoken truth that had always been there. There had always been a shadow, something lurking just beneath the surface. In their dreams they saw the faces of people they had never met, but who seemed strangely familiar. The whispers became clearer, more insistent, and the protagonist found themselves at the edge of a precipice. Was it possible that their life had been one big lie? That everything they thought they knew about themselves, about their place in the world, was fabricated? The questions piled up, and the weight of them threatened to suffocate them. But still, they couldn't ignore the pull. Something was calling to them, a force they couldn't resist, urging them to step beyond the walls they had built around their heart. The whispers grew louder, and the protagonist could no longer ignore them. Late one evening, they ventured out into the quiet wilderness that surrounded the mansion. The forest loomed ahead, its dark branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. They walked alone, their thoughts heavy with the weight of everything they had yet to discover. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the only company they had. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the realization hit them. They were no longer searching for answers in the wrong places. They weren't looking for a family or a pack. They were searching for themselves. The wind howled through the trees, the moonlight casting an eerie glow across the ground. With each step, the protagonist felt something stir inside them, a primal sense of recognition, as if the forest itself was calling them home. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the protagonist walked deeper into the night. The further they went, the more they felt the pull of something ancient, something primal calling to them. Their heart raced as the realization dawned on them. They were no longer an outsider. They were part of something bigger, something that existed beyond the confines of the world they had known. This connection, this feeling of being tethered to the earth beneath their feet, was unlike anything they had ever felt. It was as though the forest itself was alive, breathing in sync with their own pulse. The whispers, once distant, were now clearer, resonating deep within them. The truth was no longer just a mystery. It was a part of them, woven into their very being. As they reached the center of the forest, the silence enveloped them, and they stood still, letting the world around them settle. They were no longer running away from their past. They were embracing it. The winds in the forest had changed. The stillness of the previous days had shifted, replaced by an unsettling energy that seemed to stir the very air around them. The protagonist felt the tension building, the creeping sense that something was coming. What had once felt like a gentle pull toward the unknown, now felt like a force pushing them forward, inexorably drawing them deeper into the truth they had been avoiding. They could no longer ignore the whispers that seemed to come from within, a voice rising from the depths of their soul, urging them to uncover what had been hidden. As the days passed, the images of the strangers, the faces they had never seen but somehow knew, grew clearer. In their dreams, they saw shadows of themselves, fractured pieces of a past they had never lived. The betrayal from the wedding had shaken them to their core, but now it was becoming something more, an unraveling of their own identity. Were they even who they thought they were? The discovery of a hidden truth tore at the fabric of the protagonist's world. They had always thought the wedding betrayal was the most significant moment of their life, but now they realized it was merely a catalyst. What they had uncovered was far deeper, and the realization hit them like a storm, furious and unrelenting. They were no longer just a lonely outsider, they were something more. The whispers in their mind grew louder, coalescing into something more tangible. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to them, pulling them closer to a hidden revelation. The danger at the wedding was no accident, no coincidence. They had been waiting for the protagonists to realize their true nature, to finally see what they had been blind to all along. The walls that had once kept them in isolation now seemed to collapse around them, revealing a dark and powerful truth they could no longer ignore. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They were about to confront the Alpha, both the man and the force inside them. The confrontation was inevitable. The protagonist could feel the Alpha's presence, like a shadow that never left their side. Each step they took, each breath they drew, seemed to draw them closer to the truth. And as they stood before the Alpha, the floodgates of their past seemed to open, revealing everything they had ever known, and everything they had never been told. The Alpha's eyes, dark and unyielding, held them in a gaze that was both comforting and terrifying. It was as if they had known each other all their lives, even though they had never met until now. The Alpha spoke, and their voice was like thunder, shaking the very ground beneath them. "You were never meant to live in the shadows. Your destiny has always been this, standing before me." The words were like a spell, and as they lingered in the air, the protagonist felt a shift within themselves. The world they had known was crumbling, but something new was taking its place, something wild, untamed, and primal. The revelation hit harder than anything the protagonist had ever experienced. The Alpha wasn't just a figurehead, they were a part of the protagonist's own past, a bloodline that ran deeper than they had ever known. The truth was clear now, though it stung. They had been born to lead, born to claim the power they had been denied for so long. The battle within them intensified, a war between what they had been taught and what they had always felt deep inside. The Alpha, sensing the shift in them, didn't speak but watched quietly. The silence between them was heavy, as though both of them were waiting for something, an unspoken agreement to be reached. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the protagonist faced the magnitude of their birthright. Were they ready to embrace it? Could they even accept the weight of the legacy that had been thrust upon them? The questions seemed endless, but for the first time they felt a fire inside them, something they hadn't realized they had been missing until now. The final decision had arrived. With the Alpha's words still echoing in their mind, the protagonist found themselves standing at the crossroads of their destiny. They could choose to walk away, to keep running from their true nature, but the fire inside them told them otherwise. There was a hunger within them now, an unquenchable thirst to embrace the power that had always been their birthright. The weight of their decision hung heavily, the pull of the Alpha's presence growing stronger. With a deep breath, the protagonist turned toward the Alpha, eyes locked in understanding. They were ready to accept the truth, to claim their place in the world. The forest around them seemed to come alive as they stepped forward, and the air crackled with energy. The Alpha nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the protagonist's decision. And with that single motion, the moment of choice had passed, the path ahead was clear, and the protagonist was no longer an outsider. The truth had been revealed, but with it came the chaos. The world that had once seemed so predictable now crumbled beneath the weight of the protagonists' newfound identity. Their birthright was a force that could not be denied, yet it was more than they had ever bargained for. The Alpha's presence, once a mystery, now loomed over them like a dark cloud, waiting for them to step into the role they were born to play. The forest, the land, the very earth beneath their feet, seemed to react to this shift. The protagonist could feel it in the air, a subtle but undeniable hum of power. It was time to make their choice. They could resist the call, retreat into the shadows where they had once been comfortable, or they could step forward into the unknown and embrace the role that destiny had laid before them. The Alpha's words echoed in their mind. Your destiny is not just about power, it's about legacy. What legacy would they choose to leave behind? The weight of this decision pressed down on them, the burden of both fear and potential too much to carry alone. The tension between the protagonist and the Alpha was palpable. The moment of truth had arrived, and yet the path ahead was shrouded in mystery. The Alpha had shown them the way, but the protagonist now understood that the real journey was not about following someone else's path. It was about carving their own. The forest around them seemed to respond to this realization. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that sounded almost like voices, urging the protagonist to listen. They weren't just inheriting a legacy, they were building one. With each step they took toward understanding their true nature, the more they felt the power flowing through them. But with this power came something darker, something primal and wild, that they had yet to fully comprehend. The forest had been a place of sanctuary for them, but now it felt like a battlefield. A place where they would have to confront their own fears and doubts before they could fully step into the role they were destined for. The revelation came suddenly, like a thunderclap in the still night. A truth the protagonist had been avoiding was now laid bare. The Alpha was not the only one with power. There was something within the protagonist that had always been there, waiting to be unlocked. It wasn't just the power of their bloodline, but something more profound. They had always felt the stirrings of something deep inside, but they had never understood it fully until now. They had been afraid of their own power, afraid of what it could mean. But now, standing in the presence of the Alpha, they realized that the power wasn't something to fear, it was something to embrace. The winds around them began to stir with more intensity, as if the very air was charged with energy. The forest seemed to awaken, responding to the change in the protagonist. The Alpha watched them closely, knowing that the true battle was about to begin, not against an enemy, but against the protagonist's own fears. The final test had arrived. The protagonist stood before the source of their power, the ancient heart of the forest, a place that pulsed with untold energy. The Alpha had led them here, but now it was up to them to face the truth. The forest had always been a place of safety for the protagonist, but now it felt like a place of judgment. The very air seemed thick with the weight of expectation. The Alpha stepped forward, his voice a deep rumble. This is where your true power will awaken. It is not given freely, nor is it without sacrifice. The words echoed in the stillness, vibrating in the protagonist's chest. They had always known that power came with a price, but now they were faced with the reality of what that price might be. The ground beneath them trembled, as if the forest itself was alive, watching. The protagonists closed their eyes, taking a deep breath, readying themselves for the moment that would either break them or transform them forever. As the power surged through the protagonist, they felt the ground beneath them give way. It was as if they were being pulled into the very heart of the forest, their body becoming one with the earth itself. The energy was overwhelming, a force that threatened to tear them apart. But instead of resisting, they allowed it to consume them, embracing the chaos. It was only then that they understood, true power was not something to be controlled. It was something to be experienced, to be lived. As the energy coursed through them, they could feel the shift within themselves, a transformation that went deeper than anything they had ever imagined. The forest responded, the wind howling around them as if in approval. The Alpha's voice echoed through the clearing. You have done it. You are ready. With those words, the transformation was complete. The protagonist was no longer the lost, unsure individual they had been. They were something more. The weight of their new reality settled over them, but this time it was not a burden. It was a gift. The silence that followed their transformation felt deafening. For the first time in their life, the protagonist felt truly aware of themselves, of their power. It was no longer just an abstract idea. It was a tangible living force inside them. The forest around them hummed with the same energy, responding to the shift that had taken place within their very core. Every step they took now seemed purposeful, charged with a sense of destiny. But there was no turning back now. The Alpha, standing at the edge of the clearing, studied them quietly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and solemnity. He had always known the protagonist had potential, but now, the real challenge began. They had to face what they had become, and what they would do with this newfound strength. "You are ready," the Alpha said, his voice deep and resonant. "But your true test begins now. What will you do with the power you've claimed?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of the future. The reality of their transformation settled into the protagonist's bones. They were no longer the same person who had wandered through life, searching for a place to belong. They had become something more. Something dangerous and powerful. But with that power came responsibility, something they had never anticipated. The forest was no longer just a sanctuary. It had become their battleground. Every decision they made would ripple through the earth, affecting everything around them. The weight of their new reality pressed down on them, and doubt began to creep in. Could they control this force inside them, or would it consume them? The Alpha, sensing their uncertainty, stepped forward. "You are not alone in this," he said. "You have the power to lead, but you must decide what kind of leader you will be." The words felt like a challenge. The protagonist had always wanted to belong, but now they had to decide whether they would lead or follow. Days passed, and the protagonist found themselves facing the consequences of their new role. The forest, once a place of comfort, had become a realm of challenges. The animals, once friendly, now regarded them with wariness, sensing the power that had changed them. The whispers in the wind seemed to grow louder, as if the earth itself was calling them to action. But the protagonist hesitated. The Alpha had shown them the way, but now they had to prove they were worthy of this power. They had the strength to lead, but leading was more than just power. It was about wisdom, compassion, and understanding. They couldn't afford to be reckless, but every decision they made felt like a test. One wrong move could unravel everything. And yet, the pull of the forest, the pull of destiny, was too strong to ignore. The protagonist could no longer remain passive. They had to step into their role fully, accepting not just the power, but the responsibility that came with it. The call to action came sooner than expected. The forest, once peaceful, had begun to show signs of corruption. Dark forces, lurking at the edges of the world, were threatening the balance of nature. The protagonist felt the weight of this impending threat, the responsibility of protecting the land pressing down on them like a heavy cloak. The Alpha had long since stepped aside, allowing the protagonist to take the lead, but now the time had come for them to face the enemy head-on. The forest was not only their home, it was their domain to protect. The Alpha's voice echoed in the protagonist's mind, reminding them of the sacred duty they had inherited. The true test of leadership is not how you wield your power, but how you protect those who cannot protect themselves. The words resonated deeply. The protagonist had to act, to defend the forest, to protect what they had become. There was no turning back now. The battle that followed was nothing short of brutal. The forces that threatened the forest were fierce, dark beings whose power seemed to rival the protagonist's own. But the protagonist had something they didn't: resolve. Every swing, every strike, every maneuver was driven by the knowledge that the forest, the world they had come to love, was worth protecting. The dark forces seemed endless, but with each victory, the protagonist grew stronger. The battle raged on for hours, until, at last, the forest fell silent. The dark forces had been driven back, but at great cost. The protagonist stood amidst the wreckage of the battle, breathing heavily, their body battered, but victorious. The Alpha approached them slowly, his expression solemn. You have proven yourself, he said quietly. But this is just the beginning. The true test of leadership is not in battle. It is in what you do afterward. The words carried weight, and the protagonist knew that this was only the first step in a long journey of growth, leadership, and sacrifice. The forest had been restored, but peace was fleeting. The protagonist stood at the heart of the land they had sworn to protect, the echoes of battle still lingering in the air. They could feel it. The balance had been disrupted once more. The forces that had sought to corrupt the forest were gone, but new dangers had emerged from the shadows, ones even darker than before. The Alpha had been silent for days, watching the protagonist carefully, as though waiting for something to happen. The protagonist had to admit they had learned much through the battle, but they were still not ready for what came next. The whispers in the wind had grown stronger. The world itself seemed to be speaking to them, urging them forward. The true enemy, the Alpha had said, is not just outside us, but inside us. The words haunted the protagonist. Could they control the power they had awakened? Or would it be the thing that consumed them? They knew now that their true test was not just about fighting external enemies, but facing the darkness within. The days passed in tense silence. The protagonist found themselves more and more isolated, burdened by the knowledge that their power was both a gift and a curse. They could feel the presence of something dark growing closer, an enemy that was not physical but psychological, a threat that preyed on their deepest fears. It was the dark side of their power, the side they had longed to avoid. The Alpha, ever watchful, had taken a step back, allowing the protagonist to confront their own demons. There is no victory without sacrifice, the Alpha had warned. But what was the cost of victory? The protagonist's internal struggle raged. They had learned how to wield power, but they had not learned how to wield it wisely. The forest had once been a place of safety, but now it felt like a cage, a reminder of their growing power and the responsibility that came with it. With each passing day, the weight of their role pressed harder on their shoulders. One evening, as the moonlight poured over the forest, the protagonist was visited by a figure from their past, someone they never expected to see again. It was a reminder that the world they had left behind would never truly fade. The figure's eyes were filled with quiet sorrow, a sorrow that spoke of years of separation, of unfinished business. "You've changed," the figure said softly. The words cut through the protagonist's carefully constructed walls, revealing a vulnerability they hadn't realized they still had. The forest, the power. They had become a shield, a mask to protect them from the pain of the past. But now that mask was slipping. The figure was a mirror, reflecting all the things the protagonist had buried. "Do you even remember who you were before all of this?" The question lingered in the air, haunting and painful. It was a reminder that, no matter how far they ran, their past would always find them. And perhaps it was time to face it. The encounter with the past had left the protagonist shaken, but it also sparked a new understanding. They could not run from who they were, nor could they hide from the legacy they had inherited. Their power, the weight of it, was part of that legacy. But it was not all that defined them. The dark forces had been kept at bay, but the battle within, between their past and their future, between the light and the darkness, was far from over. The Alpha's words echoed in their mind. "It is not the power that makes you who you are. It is how you choose to wield it." The protagonist had to decide what kind of leader they wanted to be, not just for the forest, but for themselves. The decision was theirs alone to make. But it was becoming clearer that true strength did not come from power alone. It came from acceptance, from understanding one's past and embracing the future. The storm that had been brewing was no longer just outside, it was within them. The final decision had come. The storm that had raged inside the protagonist's soul was no longer just an internal struggle. It had taken form, becoming a battle between who they had been and who they were meant to be. The Alpha stood by, knowing this moment would define them. "You are the heart of this forest," the Alpha said quietly, "but you are also the protector of all that lives. Your choices will affect everything, not just the land, but the people in it. Led with wisdom, not power. The words held an undeniable truth. The protagonist could no longer cling to the safety of the past or the overwhelming force of their power. They had to strike a balance. As the storm raged on, both within and around them, the protagonist knew that this battle would decide their future. Would they succumb to the darkness within or rise above it to lead with the heart they had only just begun to discover? The decision was theirs, and the world was watching. The storm that had gripped the forest began to ease, but the protagonist's internal turmoil still raged. They stood at the crossroads of their journey, the weight of their choices pressing down on them like a heavy stone. The forest, the power they wielded, and the legacy of the Alpha were all part of them now, but they had to decide what role they would play. Would they lead with strength, driven by the fear of losing control? Or would they lead with wisdom, guided by compassion and a deeper understanding of their place in the world? The Alpha had always been a symbol of strength, but now, the protagonist knew that true leadership came from embracing vulnerability. They could no longer hide from who they were. They had to face their fears, their weaknesses, and their desires. The moment had arrived. The world was watching, waiting to see what path they would choose. The future was in their hands, and they were ready to make the decision, no matter the cost. The weight of leadership settled onto the protagonist's shoulders, heavier than any force they had ever faced. They had been born into this power, but the true test was not in claiming it. It was in how they wielded it. The Alpha, having watched them grow, now stepped forward with a quiet understanding. "Your destiny is yours alone to define," he said, his voice steady but carrying a depth of emotion. "But remember, it is not the strength you wield that will lead you to victory. It is the wisdom with which you use it." The words echoed in the protagonist's mind, but they knew the truth of them. The power they had gained could not be used blindly. It had to be tempered with understanding, with compassion. The storm had raged, both within them and around them, but now they had to lead, to step into the role they were meant to play. It was time to face the future, not with fear, but with the knowledge that they had the strength to shape it. The decision had been made. The protagonist would lead, but not out of fear or pride. They would lead out of love for the land, for the creatures, for the people who depended on them. The path ahead was still unclear, and dangers would undoubtedly arise. But they no longer feared what they did not understand. The future, once a source of anxiety, now felt like an open field waiting to be shaped. As the protagonist turned to face the Alpha, they knew that the time for doubt had passed. They were not the same person who had wandered into the forest all those months ago. They had found their place in the world, and now it was time to protect it. The Alpha placed a hand on their shoulder, his expression proud yet cautious. "You've come far," he said quietly, "but the real test begins now. You must remember, the greatest leaders are those who never stop learning." The words held a weight of truth, and the protagonist knew that the journey was only beginning. The forest had been their home, their sanctuary, and now it was their responsibility. The protagonist knew that there would be challenges ahead, forces, both within and outside the land, that would seek to disrupt the peace they had fought so hard to restore. But as they stood in the heart of the forest, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, they felt a deep connection to the land. This place, with all its beauty and danger, was part of them now. It was more than just a forest. It was a symbol of their own journey, of the battles they had fought, both externally and internally. The Alpha stood beside them, his presence steady, but his eyes were filled with pride. "You've earned this," he said quietly. "But remember, this power is not just for you. It is for all who call this land home." The words were a reminder of the responsibility that came with leadership. The protagonist nodded, understanding fully that their true role was not to rule, but to protect and guide. The final test had arrived, but it was not a battle. It was a choice. The protagonist had the power to reshape the world, to wield their strength in ways they had never dreamed possible. But with that power came the understanding that true leadership was not about domination. It was about understanding, about walking beside those they led, not ahead of them. The future of the forest and all its creatures depended on their decisions. As the protagonists stood before the great tree, the heart of the forest, they felt the weight of that responsibility. The alpha was gone now, his task complete, and the protagonist was left to carry the torch. They had become the leader they were always meant to be, not through power alone, but through wisdom and compassion. The wind rustled through the leaves, a silent applause for the choice that had been made. The protagonist knew that this was just the beginning, but for the first time, they were ready.